We're wrapping up our series today, and I'm bummed because I've loved 1 Samuel. I've loved the positive examples of David and Jonathan and Samuel. I've even really enjoyed the negative examples, like learning how to not repeat the failures of Eli and Hophni and Phinehas. It's just been a really good book for me, and I'm bummed. But good as it is, we have to wrap it up. Jay acknowledged that he bit off more than he could chew, and so I have 3 chapters today. But it's okay because I talk fast. And I won't talk so fast because we don't need to read every verse from 24, 25, and 26 to see a really tight theme in all 3 chapters. And truthfully, even if I just stick in, like I had a choice to just do 24, I think I would have chosen to pull 25 and 26 into it, because what you see when you bundle 24 and 25 and 26 together is this really tight theme pulled like a thread through all 3 chapters. And so I would want them all together. And the theme arises from a scenario. The scenario is repeated in all 3 vignettes. The scenario that gets repeated is you have a person presented with an opportunity to take something that they want, and maybe even that they deserve, and they can take it easily. But in order to take it easily, they would have to snatch it with a sinful swipe. But what they want is good, and the thing that they could take is right, but they would have to take it the wrong way. And that's the scenario that gets played out in all 3 chapters. And when we bundle them together, we see this really tight theme woven through all 3 chapters. And that's what we're going to see this morning. And if you're joining us for the first time, before we read verse 1, I want to give you just like 60 seconds of background so that this morning's message has context. The context is this. The king of Israel right now is Saul, and he's not a godly man. And God has anointed David to take his place as successor to the king of Israel. But standing in between David and his rightful kingship that he has been anointed to become is Saul, who is jealously clinging to power. And in his rage and in his immaturity, he is hunting David, thinking that if he can kill David, he can remove this threat to his kingship. And so over and over again, David has been hunted, cornered, but God has delivered in miraculous ways. And we left off last week with God providing a distraction with the Philistines. God provided in miraculous ways even through Philistines coming on a raid, but it provided relief from David. And that's where we pick up in chapter 24, verses 1 and 2. Let's read together. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, "Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi." Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the wild goats' rocks. The details of this encounter between Saul and David have a lot of similarities to encounters in the past. For one, David has been ratted out. This time it wasn't by the people of Ziph, but he was ratted out. It's also similar that it's in the wilderness because David chose rugged terrain to hide his location, so that's a similarity. But this situation plays out way different because God's deliverance for David is not from a distraction and it's not from some outside force. It's actually God delivering David by giving David an opportunity to prove his innocence. How does that happen? Well, it happens in verse 3. Then he came to the sheepfolds, that's Saul, and Saul came to the sheepfolds by the way, and there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. The means of God's deliverance, unlike other situations, is that Saul is relieving himself. Now, if you don't like potty humor, you're gonna have to tune out for just a minute. This won't take long, unlike Saul's bathroom break. But we do have to talk about this because it actually is helpful. You have to understand how vulnerable Saul was. Now, the phrase relieving himself gets translated from kind of a strange Hebrew phrase that means to cover one's feet, literally to cover one's feet. And sometimes it means sleeping. In fact, some Bible translations translate this verse, Saul was in a cave sleeping. But more likely, Saul was going to the bathroom, and not number 1. In fact, David Sumara, who is an expert on the book of 1 Samuel and a Hebrew scholar, said that Saul was evacuating his bowels. evacuating his bowels. I don't have to explain anymore. Because we can understand from the situation that Saul is distracted. He's paying zero attention to what's in the back of the cave. And while it's funny, and while Saul is kind of obnoxiously in view here, if we shift our focus to David, this is actually a really interesting moment for David. In fact, it's a pivotal moment for David. Because for the first time, David is presented not just with a way out, like God provided like a means for his escape, but David is presented with an opportunity to actually take what God has been given him, or what God has given him through promise. God has promised David, you will be king, and now God delivers Saul into the cave, and Saul is completely oblivious, and he's vulnerable. And this seems too good to be true. Like it seems too much of a coincidence that Saul just ends up in the cave where David is hiding, and David's men are like, this has to be God. David's men tell David, this has to be God. It's too much of a coincidence. In fact, David's men go on to tell him, and the men of David said to him, here is the day which the Lord said to you, behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you. David is at, a scary crossroads, because it seems like God has teed up for him a scenario where he can take what has been promised him, what he wants. The only thing standing in between him and the kingship is Saul, and Saul is now laid out vulnerable, and David can take it. It's right there. It's right there. And then he has his friends saying, David, this is from God. This is God's provision. How could it be that Saul ends up in your cave? By the way, this is all happening while Saul's going to the bathroom. This is a long potty break. Sorry, I said I was going to be short with it, and I wasn't. But here's the thing. Is this not a fascinating crossroads for David? It's a fascinating crossroads for David, because will he take it? And what's just torturous about this is that this advice from his friends is faulty. It's flawed. This prophecy that they tell him, God has given this into your hands, it's actually mentioned nowhere in Scripture. This prophecy is unknown. It's possible that his friends are misquoting another prophecy given to somebody else, or it's possible his friends just made it up. It's possible his friends just made it up because they want David to kill Saul so they can be done running. If Saul's out of the picture, David and his men don't have to run anymore. So it's possible his friends are just feeding him kind of selfish advice, like do the thing so we can be done. And all of that is piled on David, and he has a choice. He can take what is rightfully his, but he would have to take it with a sinful swipe. Because David knows Exodus 22:28, which says, do not blaspheme God or curse the ruler of your people. God forbade even cursing your ruler, let alone killing them. And David knew that. And he knew that God would never tee up sin. God would never tee up a promise of his fulfillment or fulfilling his promise through sinful means, ever. That is never God's way to accomplish his ordained plan through sinful means. He would not tee that up for David. So what does he do? We read in verse 4, David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Paul's robe. He doesn't kill him. He cuts off a corner of his robe. And David knew that at the corner of the robe, there was a tassel. And he's going to use this tassel as irrefutable evidence that he could have killed Saul, but he didn't. And he's going to use this hard evidence to prove his innocence and try to call Saul off the chase. And it's with this tassel in mind that he lets Saul finish his business and then go about his way. And we might think that we should just applaud David and celebrate this restraint, because is this not just amazing restraint? He could have taken the kingship by force, and he doesn't. All he does is send Saul a message proving his innocence. We should applaud that, right? Not so fast. Listen to what David says next. David says this in verse 5. And afterward, David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. David feels guilty, not celebratory. David doesn't feel victorious, he actually feels guilty. He feels guilty because he knew that this wasn't an innocent act. See, Israel had a strict national dress code. I mean, super strict. The Torah outlined exactly how outer garments were to look. And at the corner of a robe were to be tassels. 4 corners, 4 tassels. And there were to be 4 tassels for the king. And David cut one off. Not only was David cutting off a tassel as hard evidence, he was cutting out a tassel to make Saul invalid. His national dress code, he was now in violation of his national dress code, and David feels guilty. He knows that he hasn't just sent Saul a message, he's actually humiliated him. And he knows that that is cursing his ruler. He knows that while he just showed restraint, he let a small sin substitute for a big sin. He knows that he didn't go all the way and give full vent. He didn't go all the way and snatch what he could have snatched, but he took a little bit. And a small sin, David knows immediately that a small sin is not a suitable substitute for a big sin. And I think we all need to hear that this morning, that a small sin is not a suitable substitute for a big sin. And so David's remorseful. And so should we celebrate David's restraint? We should. But we should acknowledge that it is never God's plan for us to sin. And I think we can pull this down into 2023 really easily. You're probably not waiting for the kingship to be delivered to you. And you're probably not standing over the only person who's in your way, able to kill them. That's probably not your scenario, but you probably have a job. And you might feel dissatisfied in your job. In fact, you might feel so frustrated because you've been passed over for rightful promotion. In fact, you may even be wrongfully denied promotion. Like you've been promised something and then it hasn't been delivered, and promised and then it's been taken away, and you might feel so slighted. And then David's scenario becomes your scenario, because a situation will get teed up for you where you can actually recoup all those wrongful denials. You can recoup all those losses, and all it will cost you is one little lie. A situation will get teed up that's so perfect, nobody will know, and you can take what you think you deserve, and nobody will know, but you will have to take it with a sinful step. And then David's scenario becomes your scenario, because what will you do? One little lie to recoup all that you've been wrongfully denied. That's real. Or maybe you're a student, and maybe you're a really good student, and you have to miss class for a soccer game. And your friend gives you the homework that you missed in class while you're at soccer. And like the good student that you are, you stay up late doing your homework. And you do the problems, but it's the wrong problems. And then the next morning, you realize it's the wrong problems. And your friend realizes, I gave you the wrong problems, and they feel terrible. And you're a good student. And they're like, hey, I'm so sorry. Why don't you just copy my homework between classes? It's my fault anyway. And in that moment, your situation is David's situation. You can take something that maybe you feel like you deserve, like you were wronged. You were given the wrong homework. And you did the right thing by doing it. But now you have a choice. Will you take what is rightfully yours, or what you feel like is rightfully yours, with a sinful step? And those situations are everywhere. What will you do when you can take something that you want, maybe even need, maybe deserve, but you'd have to take it with a sinful step? And the message comes through loud and clear. David shows us, don't sin to win. Is it winning to get what you want? Yeah, kind of, because we're all working at things that are good. It's good to win. David could have won by taking the kingship, but he would have had to take it through sin. You can win at work, but you can win the wrong way. You can win at school, and you can win the wrong way. You can win in relationships, and you can win the wrong way. And the message comes through loud and clear, don't sin to win. And David gets it mostly right. He gets it mostly right. He doesn't take the kingship by force, but he lets a small sin substitute for a big sin. But he's going to get another chance in chapter 26, and he's going to learn. And he's going to do it the right way that time. But first, the situation has to play out. We don't have time to read all of chapter 24, but in verses 8 through 21, the interaction after the cave plays out. David lets Saul get a ways from the cave, and then David goes and holds up the tassel and calls him out. Says, I'm not the traitor you think I am. I'm innocent. Look, I could have killed you. And Saul has a change of heart. He knows that he's been bested. There is hard evidence that he just got beat at his own game. He was the hunter, he became the prey, and he lets David go in peace. In fact, he even blesses him. He has a change of heart. And right about that time, Samuel dies, which is a terrible moment in the nation of Israel because Samuel is a heavyweight. He's a national leader, and everybody gathers for the funeral. David even goes, even though he's hunted and on the run, David goes. We know he goes because he leaves where he is to go up to where the funeral was held, and he finds himself near Maon. And it's after the funeral, as David is in Maon, that we meet two characters, Abigail and Nabal. So in 25, we're introduced to these new characters. We start reading in verse 2. And there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich, and he had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, and the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. And this feels really random. It's like, why are we just getting introduced to Abigail and Nabal now? This feels kind of random, but it's not random because they've actually been part of the story before. They just weren't named. Earlier in chapter 3, we know that David was near Maon. We know that David actually interacted with Nabal's shepherds. So this is not a random airdrop of characters into the story. This has actually been playing out for a while. Earlier in chapter 23, we read that David was in Maon. It just says in chapter 23, verse 24, now David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, in the Arabah, to the south of Jeshimon. Verses like that can feel like flyover verses, like there's nothing there, I'll just move on. Except that it shows us that David actually interacted with Nabal before. He interacted with his shepherds. And we're going to see that played out in just a second. David interacted with Nabal's shepherds, and he did him a solid. Like, shepherds were vulnerable. It would often happen that shepherds were looking after their sheep, and raiding parties would come and take the sheep, kill the shepherds. Things would go missing. David comes upon Nabal's shepherds, and instead of providing for his men by taking Nabal's sheep, he actually protects their sheep. Instead of taking something through ill-gotten gain, David actually does a noble thing, and he provides like a wall of protection around Nabal's shepherds. So much so that nothing went missing. David's a good dude, even when nobody's looking. Nobody's watching him here. And he does the right thing. And now he finds himself near Maon. He finds himself near Maon, and Nabal is throwing a feast because he's shearing his sheep. It's a big festival. When you shear sheep and you're rich, it is a fabulous occasion. And there's feasting, and there's all kinds of good stuff. And so David's like, great, this is perfect. I'm gonna send some messengers to Nabal. And I'm gonna ask Nabal, hey, can you load up my 10 messengers? Can you pay me back? You can even ask them. I was good to them. We protected them. Could you provide for us? And this is a normal request. This is even a good request because Nabal is rich, really rich. Like so rich that it would have cost him almost nothing to load up David's 10 servants and send them on their way with lots of food. But Nabal's a jerk, like a total turd. Listen to how he responds. In 24, verse 10, listen to how Nabal responds to David's really normal, really reasonable request. Nabal says, and Nabal answered David's servants, who's David? And who's the son of Jesse? There's lots of servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I've killed for my shears and give it to the men whom I don't even know were here? I mean, this is an insult. I mean, this is like next level smack talking. Because to say who is David is like, who's LeBron James? Like, it's almost insulting how silly it is. Everybody knew David. I mean, he killed Goliath as a youngster. Like, everybody knows David. And for Nabal to say, who is this guy? I hear there's all kinds of people running away from their masters. Is insulting. David makes a good request and he gets insulted. And what does he do? Does he turn the other cheek? Does he learn from the cave incident? Not this time. What's his response? He's furious. In fact, he's so angry. Listen to how he responds in verse 12. So David's young men turned away and came back and told him all this. And David said to his men, every man strap on your sword. And every one of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword, and about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. David's about to take 400 armed men and go and crash Nabal's party. And the swords are not for shearing sheep. The swords are for Nabal. David's been insulted. And instead of letting God clear his name, he's going to go clear his own name by clearing Nabal. He's going to go and wipe out everybody, not just Nabal. In fact, David is so blinded by rage that he's rehearsing the evil he's going to commit. If you go on and read later in verses 21, he's rehearsing how awful he's going to be. He is so blinded by rage, but here's what you need to know. He's not justified. David's about to take matters into his own hands, just like he had the opportunity to do in the cave. In the cave, he could have taken matters into his own hands and he didn't. This time, he's like, nope, I'm going to do it myself. And he is squarely in the wrong, like 100% in the wrong. Nabal's insult does not justify his sinful response. Yes, Nabal's a jerk. Yes, Nabal's a jerk. It does not justify killing him. And he would have been guilty. He's not thinking clearly. He's angry, he's blinded by rage, and he's about to go and commit murder. And then Abigail steps in. And Abigail is awesome. As awful and bullheaded as Nabal is, Abigail is intelligent and wise and courageous. And as soon as she is told what happens, she acts immediately. Verse 18 says, then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 skins of wine and 5 sheep already prepared and 5 seahs of parched grain and 500 clusters of raisins, 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on donkeys. She acts fast. How fast does she act? David goes from Nabal back to his men. They strap on swords and they're on their way back. Before David can even get back, Abigail has met him on the road. She is wise and she is prepared and she is virtuous and she is incredibly shrewd. She throws herself on the train tracks to stop something evil that's about to happen. Listen to how she responds or how she approaches David, starting in verse 23. When Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She fell on his feet and said, on me alone, my Lord, let the guilt be. Let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. Is it Abigail's fault that all this happened? Not a chance. And yet, what does she do? She throws herself on the tracks and is going to take the fall in David's eyes, but begs for mercy. She begs for mercy, but she's not blubbery and weepy. She's intelligent and shrewd and incisive. She is deft because she switches from asking for mercy to actually teaching David. She's going to school him. She's not just begging for mercy, she's about to coach him. Listen to what she says. She says, and she's going to use Lord twice, lowercase l for David, capital L for God. Listen to what she says. This is Abigail teaching David. She says, now, my Lord, as the Lord lives, that's David, lowercase l, capital L, God. Now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand. Now let your enemies be as those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. Abigail has to throw a left hook because David is so blinded by rage. This is the left hook. She's like, you're not just about to commit murder and be guilty. You're actually trusting yourself more than God. You are working salvation by your own hand. Like the middle of that needs to be repeated. Abigail says, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand. David's about to commit murder, and even worse, he's about to take matters into his own hands and stop trusting God. Remember the lesson from chapter 21, which sword will you trust? David had an opportunity in chapter 21 to trust God's provision or to trust his own accomplishments. And he chose to trust his own accomplishments, and it was symbolized by Goliath's sword. Goliath's sword was the perfect symbol of human accomplishment. Little shepherd boy defeating a giant. Human accomplishment, except it wasn't, it was God's accomplishment. But David picks Goliath's sword to trust. He trusts in his accomplishments, and now he's trusting in the wrong sword again. But it's not Goliath's sword, it's the sword strapped to his side. He's gonna run straight into Nabal's dinner party and take revenge for himself. He's gonna save his own name by his own hand. And that's where Abigail meets him. And the left hook works. I'm amazed at David's humility to see in the moment that he is being rebuked and to respond. Listen to how he responds to Abigail in verse 32. He said, and David said to Abigail, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from the working of salvation with my own hand. He goes on to say, for surely as the Lord God of Israel lives, who would have restrained me from hurting you unless you had hurried and come out to meet me. Truly by morning there had been left to Nabal not one male. David was gonna wipe them all out. And Abigail does the righteous thing even when it was hard. And there's so many things about Abigail that we could say this morning, so many, but I'll pick one. Abigail did the righteous thing even when it cost her. You're like, what did it cost Abigail? She got to save her life. I don't think it's a whole lot of speculation. I don't think it's too big of a jump to say that Abigail was in a terrible marriage. If Nabal responds to David the way that he responded to him, it is not a far cry to say that Nabal was not a good husband. If you treat David that way, how much more will you treat the people in your family? And Abigail has an opportunity. She hears that David's about to come and level Nabal, destroy him. She has an opportunity to get relief from a terrible husband, but she would have to get relief at David's murderous hands. She could have let David do something for her that maybe she's wanted all along. I don't know that for a fact, but I don't feel like that speculation is reaching too far to think that Abigail maybe for a second thought, I could be done with Nabal and David will do it. But she doesn't. Not only does she call David off killing Nabal, she takes the fall. She says, let it fall on me. She's so good. She's so good. And I think we can pull this down, like all the way down into our scenario, because you might be in a marriage like Abigail. You probably aren't presented with a scenario where you can let somebody come in and kill your awful spouse. But like Abigail, you may feel like you are married to an absolute jerk. And this jerk of a spouse doesn't meet your needs. You feel wrung out and you feel cold and tired. And you feel like you put yourself out there over and over again only to be left alone. And then a situation will get plopped in your lap for you to meet your needs. Good needs. Our physical needs good? Yes. Our emotional needs good? Yes. Our relational needs good? Yes. But you will be presented with an opportunity to meet your needs with a sinful swipe and to take what is good with a sinful step. But Abigail doesn't. She trusts God's provision, and God does provide. God provides relief from Nabal. We go on to read in verse 36, and Abigail came to Nabal. In verse 36, and Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house, like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until the morning light. In the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him all these things, and his heart died within him, and he became as a stone. And about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. Abigail trusted God to provide, not by her hands, and God provided at his hand. And we can be like we can be like Abigail and trust God to provide relief from the Nabals that are in our life. We can. But it requires us to meet in that moment the opportunity to take something good with a sinful swipe. We have to meet that moment by rehearsing over and over again. Don't sin to win. Don't sin to win. Our third vignette shows yet again the same scenario of taking something or wanting to take something, but taking it with a sinful swipe. Again, the Ziphites. If you were with us a couple weeks ago, the Ziphites. The Ziphites. Nobody thinks that's funny. I don't know. It's the Ziphites again who are going to sell them out. It's actually not that funny, but Ziphite is kind of a fun word to say. So I thought I could get it in there like 4 or 5 times. The Ziphites sell Saul some info. They rat David out. They rat him out because they're afraid. They're more afraid of Saul than they are wanting to be aligned with the rightful king, and they sell him out in verses 1 and 2. Then the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah and said, "Is not David hiding himself on the hill of Hachilah, which is on the east of Jeshimon?" So Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph with 3,000 chosen men of Israel to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. It's the same scenario on repeat. David's going to get another chance to take what is rightfully his, but he's going to be presented with that opportunity that will require a sinful step. This time, though, David takes the fight to David, and he takes his nephew, Abishai. And in verses 3 through 9, David and Abishai sneak through a sleeping camp all the way to Saul. Like an entire army, 3,000 men, David and Abishai sneak in the night all the way to Saul. In fact, they get to Saul with Abner sleeping right next to Saul, and Abishai looks at David and goes, "This has to be God. It has to be God. There's no way we could have gotten here if it wasn't God. Let me kill him." Notice the subtle shift. David gets the opportunity to take the kingship again by force, but this time he doesn't have to do it. This time Abishai will do it. And maybe Abishai is thinking, he'll take the bait if I do it. He wasn't going to do it, but we've got to be done with this because this is ridiculous. And so Abishai tells David, "This is God's provision. Let me give it to you." But this time David learns from the cave. He learns from the cave. He learns from the scenario with Nabal, and he says no. He says no. He won't even let Abishai kill him. Listen to what he says in verse 10. In 26, verse 10, David makes a strong statement. Strong. David said, "And the Lord, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him down. It's not my job. Or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I will put my hand against the Lord's anointed." And he forbid anybody else from doing the same. Abishai was not going to kill him. But he said, "Instead, take the spear and the water jug and let's go." David learns from the encounter and doesn't let a small sin substitute for a big sin. He takes the water jug, he takes the spear. This time, he wasn't embarrassing Saul. He was just sending him a message. There was no requirement for a king to have a spear. There was no requirement for a king to have a water jug. So David was not putting Saul out of alignment with the Torah. It was just a message. He didn't cut corners, literally or figuratively. He didn't embarrass Saul. He just sends him a message to prove his innocence. He gets up on a hill, he calls out Saul just like last time, and just like last time, Saul has a change of heart. In fact, so much of a change of heart that Saul invites him to come home. David's like, "Yeah, there's not a chance." He's like, "Here's your spear, send a messenger, come get it. Here's your water jug, send a messenger, come get it. I'm out." And David leaves. This is actually the last encounter between Saul and David while they're living. Saul will die in battle, just like David said, or prayed, that God will take care of it. I don't know how, but God will take care of it. This is their last encounter. And David figures it out to not win with sin, to trust God's provision. And I love how all 3 vignettes, all 3 of them, give a vivid picture. I mean, like a colorful picture of somebody standing over an opportunity, just standing over something good. The kingship was good. Relief from a bad marriage is good. Having your needs met is good. Getting what is promised you is good. But in all three scenarios, the message comes through loud and clear. Don't sin to win. Twice David stood over Saul. Twice. Twice David got bad intel saying, this is God's provision, take it. David realized this is not God's way. Abigail could have been rid of Nabal, but instead she chose not only to do the righteous thing for her, but to do the righteous thing for David and to rebuke David so that he wasn't guilty and to save the future king, the rightful king, from blood guilt. And in all three episodes, it seems like the sinful play, the easy way out, the cutting corners, it seems like that's the right way to go. But when the story plays out, we see God provide in miraculous ways. Some of the miraculous ways that God provided in just these 3 chapters, let alone the whole book. In chapter 24, God provided a bathroom break. God can provide through a bathroom break. David got to clear his name through provision of a bathroom break. In chapter 25, God provided relief for Abigail in ways that she could never have imagined. And then in chapter 26, we didn't read this verse, but I want to close with this verse because this verse shows that when you choose to win God's way, God will provide in miraculous ways. Read verse 12, chapter 26, verse 12. So David took the spear and the jar of water from Saul's head, and they went away. No man knew it or saw it, nor did any awake, for they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. David chose to win God's way. He got to vindicate his name, clear his name before Saul. Saul left and went on his way. God provided relief. What did he use? Sleep. He used sleep. He put everyone in that 3,000 person army to sleep. And David got to walk right up to Saul, take the spear, take the jug, and clear his name. God will provide in ways that we can't even imagine when we fully trust him. But in order to get to that place where you see God provide in miraculous ways, you have to commit long in advance to not sin to win. Because the time to decide I'm gonna do the right thing is not when you're standing over what you want. When you are standing over top of what you want and you can snatch it with a sinful snatch and you haven't rehearsed that you are gonna win God's way, man, you're in for a world of hurt. Because choosing in that moment when you haven't prepared ahead of time to do what is right is really hard. But if you rehearse ahead of time over and over and over again, days, weeks, months, years ahead of time, I will win God's way. And I will trust him for provision. You will see God provide in miraculous ways, but you have to get there. You have to say no to the sinful swipe in order for the provision. Jay says all the time, by our timetables, God is rarely early, but he's never late. And if you think God's late, the likelihood that you snatch what you want with a sinful swipe goes way up. But if you know that God is never late, and he will provide miraculously when you trust, you can wait another minute, another hour, another month, a year, and you can trust God to provide. The message comes through loud and clear from David and Abigail. Don't sin to win. Let's pray. God, we love you so much, and we trust you so much, even when it hurts. Like when it's so tough to not take what we want, what we need, maybe even what you have promised us, to not take it with a sinful swipe, but we exercise trust this morning, God. God, stay our hand from taking with ill-gotten gain things that are good, and help us to trust you to provide. And God, we just pray for that miraculous intervention. We believe it will come because we know who you are and we know that you provide. And God, I pray for my brothers and sisters here that they would be strengthened in their faith to do that. And we love you so much and pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.